Strengthening the Pacific Feminist Identity. And for people who are unfamiliar, I'm been a PhD candidate at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and I've recently submitted my thesis. This particular presentation today is a working paper. Of course, everybody wants to publish something out of their thesis, and so this is my first cab off the rank. So I'm really open to suggestions and comments. And in particular, I wanted to cover, oh, my slideshow is not working. Why is my slideshow not working? My slides aren't moving. Now they are. In particular, I wanted to provide some context on the literature on Pacific feminisms to really situate this in the literature, and then I want to look at the very practical aspects of how is Pacific feminism being strengthened, looking at two particular recent initiatives. So when we study feminist civil society in the Pacific, there's a recurring question that comes up around the notion of feminism itself and how it's understood in the Pacific. So feminist theorists throughout the past have criticised aspects of attempts to oppose Western notions of feminism on others throughout the world. And their main critique's been around the assertion of feminism capturing the experience of mainly white, cisgendered, heterosexual and middle-class women only. So for example, Daniels in 2015 argued that the trouble with mainstream feminism has been its failure to acknowledge racist or sexist behaviour. And Corbett and Lickey in 2015 rightly identified that foreign donors focus on women's empowerment and tend to impose their own gender norms in the region, and they fail to acknowledge the very context-specific understanding of feminism. And this requires paying attention to intersectionality and what it means in the context of the Pacific region. So intersectionality is the acknowledgement of the interacting and simultaneous effects of the multiple axes of oppression. So this could be gender or race or class or age or ethnicity or ability, and so one can't be understood in isolation from the other. And intersectionally was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She drew attention to the fact that feminist and anti-racist campaigns left women of colour invisible. She argued that when feminist theory and politics claims to reflect women's experiences and women's aspirations, if they do not speak to or include Black women, they cannot make claims about what women are or what women need. And she noticed that this exclusion was reinforced when white women speak for and as women, leaving feminism's potential to broaden and deepen its analysis by addressing non-privileged women unrealised. So she identified that feminist efforts to politicise experiences of women and anti-racist efforts to politicise people of colour proceed as if the issues and experiences they detail occur on mutually exclusive terrains. They readily intersect in the lives of real people, but seldom do they in feminist practices. And because of this either-or proposition, they relegate the identity of women of colour to a location that resists telling. So Crenshaw also pointed out that conflicts have developed over differing definitions of feminism, stemming from a failure to recognise that different circumstances under which feminist consciousness develops and manifests itself within minority communities has resulted in women of colour leaving coalitions to return to community-based organisations. And they prefer to struggle over women's issues within their community rather than struggle over issues with Western imposed notions of feminism. So what I'm looking at is this idea of intersectionality. And these are really important implications for Pacific feminism, because a focus on intersectionality underpins the need for a Pacific-specific feminism and approaches to ensure that feminism remains relevant for the specific concerns facing Pacific women and rather than imposed from elsewhere. And this ongoing debate's been really well captured by Pacific feminist scholar Vanessa Griffin in a report on a Pacific Women's Workshop, where she explained a Pacific feminism would be defined by Pacific women and cover issues that were relevant to them, such as cultural imperialism. For example, women need to develop a feminist ideology to analyse the wider issues of women's struggles, which were important to them as women and as Pacific people. For example, social inequalities, the role and influence of institutions such as the church. It would allow Pacific women to question a different way issues such as colonialism and imperialism. She said that having a feminist perspective would influence the questions Pacific women asked about institutions and enable women to challenge conditions and cultural practices that contribute to their oppression. So in order to have traction, a Pacific-defined feminism needs to be context-specific. And as this quote reveals, many Pacific issues that women face, such as the institutional and cultural barriers to their leadership, are very country context specific or sub-region specific. So understanding these norms and cultural codes is crucial if we're going to create a Pacific-specific feminism. Griffin's report further highlighted the importance of self-defining feminism in the Pacific as a perspective that women in the Pacific could live and work with, to arrive at a perspective or philosophy which would be our Pacific understanding of what feminism means to us. So she saw that working through their own ideas of a Pacific feminism includes benefits in producing a greater sharing and a greater sisterhood. So in this brief explanation of my working paper, I seek to outline the prospects and challenges of strengthening a feminist collective identity in the Pacific. In recent years, feminist activists have been facing significant backlash, and spaces for social movement mobilisation are shrinking. Pacific feminists are increasingly interacting with regional peers and looking for ways to build and strengthen feminist alliances, to join forces. There have been various recent initiatives in the Pacific to build and strengthen feminist alliances among civil society, and this paper focuses on two such initiatives, the We Rise Coalition and the Pacific Feminist Forum. And it explores the role of the Forum and the Coalition in generating a collective identity and a voice for Pacific feminists. In order to understand how civil society actors in the Pacific can build a Pacific feminism and a shared feminist agenda, I conducted interviews, a focus group, and participant observation of the Pacific Feminist Forum in 2016. I'll present various insights of the research on a negotiated sisterhood and explain how it's enacted in the Pacific. And this concept really captures the dynamic and very diverse nature of the feminism and feminist activities in the region. So the first case study, the Pacific Feminist Forum, took place in November 2016 in Suva in Fiji. And it brought together 100 women from over 13 different countries in the Pacific region. And the forum really explored what a Pacific feminism would look like. And importantly, it culminated in the negotiation and acceptance of the Charter of Feminist Principles for Pacific Feminists. And this charter really marked what it meant for Pacific women to be defined as feminists. It set out their collective principles and it noted, importantly, their common bonds of ocean, land, and ancestors. A second Pacific Feminist Forum took place in 2019, again in Fiji, and this was important as the Charter Action Plan was launched to aid the Charter implementation that I'll go into in a minute.
Sorry, Jane, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides moving. So I don't know if you're showing us in the slides, but it's still the title page only. So
I have been showing you my slides.
Okay, so I just wanted to bring this to your attention. Maybe you change the mode of presentation, include your notes as well, but we can see the slides at least. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Let me just can you see the slide change now?
Yes.
Great, okay. So, I'm down to here. So, as I was mentioning, the Pacific Feminist Forum really negotiated an incredible charter, which was the basis of shared advocacy for Pacific feminists. And to give you an idea of it, it wasn't just contained within this forum, but it was disseminated very broadly. It was included, for example, in the Pacific Civil Society Organising Mechanism meeting, Working group members were also part of the drafting from the Pacific Feminist Forum, were also part of the drafting of the Pacific Organising Committee outcome document. So they got to actually put those charter parts straight into the outcome document in a broader forum. Similarly, at the 61st session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the charter was integrated into the communications for the CSW community and funders and development partners. It was also mentioned at the CSW in a side event on sharing South feminist knowledge. Further, national conventions of organising committee members of the Pacific Feminist Forum have shared hundreds of copies of the charter. It was also further shared at another conference in as far as Myanmar to really get some of these messages out about what does it mean to be a Pacific feminist. It was similarly shared at a Fiji Young Women's Forum on gender budgeting. It's been shared again at the High Level Political Forum in New York, which looks at the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's further been distributed to the Pacific Young Women's Alliance. So this is really helping to amplify the collective voice that's been developed in the forum. Just make sure my slides are moving. Most importantly, it was also included in the triennial meeting of women's ministers and Pacific women, where direct lifts were taken from the Feminist Charter to influence the outcome document of the triennial meeting. Now, in order to find issues and areas needing attention, a lot of time was spent at this specific forum to really list out, well, what are the struggles that Pacific women face? Where are their commonalities? Where are their differences? How could they actually come to some kind of common agenda? And of particular interest to this group, there was a deliberative circle using a traditional mat. And I want to spend a little bit of time to just run you through how they used this deliberative circle to share their journeys and their struggles. So the circle participants were chosen to ensure a full range of voices were teased out. So you can see in the picture, there were young women and older women, lesbian woman, a disabled woman, a woman from an elite background who spoke of her privilege and now her activism. And one of the standout moments of this feminist knowledge circle was when the traditional conservative woman from the long-standing Indigenous women's group invited one of the transgender women to one of her meetings. And she said she'd very much welcome her to attend. And this was reflected later on by one of the participants as one of the moments from the forum that would stick with her for as long as she lived. This was a lovely sharing. It was very powerful. And even if you take away the potentially performative element of the type of gesture, it's the great example of the gesture that bringing women together in solidarity is designed to achieve. And the mat was a significant part of the design of the Pacific Feminist Forum, because it was a breakaway from a more staid conference style. And recognition has been given of its significance in Pacific culture. You look at someone like young Leslie, for example. And so part of the background of this use of the pandanus mat was very important, because one participant, for example, noted it was how they discuss most of their forums in the region. We sit on our mats and we discuss our issues, she said. So the mat's very recognisable as a place for discussion and deliberation, and you may have heard of the phrase Talanoa in the region, which is what this was. And this setting perhaps has made possible the invitation that I talked about just above, because it was a place that's always generated discussion and ways forward over difficult issues. And it's a place that represents the respectful coming together in the spirit of finding solutions. So the mat practice was used again and again over the 3 days of the Pacific Feminist Forum. And so it really did give that very specific context, but also it was political, because in some Pacific Island countries, of course, it's the older men that serve as the decision makers. So to see feminists claiming the space as decision makers around the mat really set the tone. And the conversations taking place on the pandanus mat offer a very practical illustration of the power of circle deliberation, which has been described in scholarship For example, if you look at Lee, 2014, Lee argued that circles are symbolically used to take turns sharing, to get away from positional power or authority, and also circle sharing visibly establishes equality. There's no head, there's no hierarchy. So the Feminist Knowledge Circle offered a platform for inclusion. It was not just for one party to impose their ideas on the other, it was about ways to see ideas afresh. And it was as much about revealing differences as striving for a kind of unity. And the participants in the circle were chosen to flag different angles and different starting points. And so this symbolic power was demonstrated in using the mat. The organisers very much strove to adopt a practice with limited resourced intervention by a chair in the discussions. The practice from the outset was really reinforced because others went and took it up again and again. For example, in the later session on the Pacific Feminist Civil Society-led research, it was described as a feminist learning circle and listening room. And it was not just limited to talk as a means of interacting with one another, but also very much the practice of listening. And we've had people in these seminars previously talk about the practice of listening. Also, this circle didn't just focus on success, but it drew on the mistakes and challenges as part of the learning journey. It was really openly labelled as such as part of the program. And open sharing was very much part of the practice to lead to movement building because it enabled young feminists in the room to tackle troubling issues and yet be sustained. It was very energising and uplifting, and we were all sitting around watching this practice happen. It was truly inclusive of young and disabled people and diverse sexual orientations and older women, and it was very much participating and hands-on decision making. And the organisers really described it as a booming voice of Pacific women collectively speaking for themselves and their countrywomen. The next case study is the We Rise Coalition. It was a 4-partner coalition of diverse feminist organisations. And from 2016 to 2019, which was the time period of my research, it was made up of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, FemLink, and the International Women's Development Agency. And We Rise really demonstrates how a deliberate and mindful dialogue across difference is the key to the ability to build a shared vision to sustain and realise the goals of an amplified, diverse feminist voice regionally. We Rise really acts to increase the visibility and input of those who have no power and no voice, and it really grows the capacity of the marginalised to promote social change. And the diversity of the We Rise partners is illustrative of the strategic dimension of the work, where they generate more action on gender equality advocacy. They consciously create spaces for airing disagreements, and they find ways to work together on an agreed advocacy platform, despite some of the partners coming from very different positions, some much more radical. So there were some lessons that we could pull together by looking at these 2 case studies. Pacific feminists, even when calling themselves feminists, are not suggesting that they import a Western-style feminism. And through the use of case studies, this paper makes an important contribution to the scholarly discussion of building context-specific feminisms through intersectional alliance building, and it gives these 5 insights. So the Pacific Feminist Forum offered a safe space for Pacific women to meet and advance a shared agenda across the region. Acknowledging differences was very important for building a shared vision. Building effective alliances requires recognising the minorities within the group and countering their marginalisation. Visual artefacts, such as T-shirts that were used and given out at the Pacific Feminist Forum, really did help the formation of a collective identity across difference. And alliance building does not require everyone to identify as a feminist. So this working paper, I'm really working on providing practical ways forward in feminist and intersectional inclusion. So for example, inclusive of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and such as they were very trans inclusive at this forum and in the charter. And we see the emergence of a very strong Pacific feminist intersectional voice in the region. And the practical examples of negotiating diverse alliances from a Pacific perspective contribute to global feminist scholarship too, as often we only hear about the global north. So we'd hear about North America or Europe, or if we do hear about the global south, often it's limited to Latin America. So this focus contributes to making sure Pacific initiatives are acknowledged and part of the body of knowledge. So importantly, the Pacific Feminist Forum and the We Rise Coalition show different instances of building a Pacific-specific feminism in the region. An essential theme that runs across both cases concerns the negotiated nature of building a feminist sisterhood. I define this negotiated sisterhood as a form of solidarity where feminist civil society actors create safe spaces of respectful discussion across difference, which then leads them to trust building and transparent learnings amongst the participants. The interviews revealed that sisterhood or solidarity is not a given. It needs to be actively created and recreated by the actors on the ground. And this process is not as seamless as it sounds. Pacific feminists, of course, are not a homogenous group, but they comprise diverse identities with diverse agendas. The ways the actors negotiate solidarity to establish and build alliances at a regional level provides lessons for the strengthening of movements and supports additional inclusive spaces. Overall, the interviews and participant observation show that negotiation of an intersectional solidarity is both possible and desirable between diverse women. However, it also indicated it's not easy. And one of the challenges is navigating across difference to form a coalition across dispersed, diverse places and against a backdrop that's resistant to gender equality often and discriminates against openly diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. It takes a rigorous internal process of checking in on how power is going to form a coalition and navigate difference and build a solidarity. In the case of We Rise and the Pacific Feminist Forum, this has been done mainly by putting a particular emphasis on planning and communication. The case studies show how different civil society actors navigate their diversity, put aside differences, and focus on aspects that can be advocated for collectively, and how they engage in dialogue in order to bridge different perspectives and amplify the voices of marginalised groups. Pacific feminists share initiatives, reconcile differences of goals, resolve tensions, work across difference, and sustain actions which have resulted in Pacific feminist civil society being able to build a collective identity. A better understanding of the negotiation of a Pacific-specific feminism provides ways forward to foster diversity in feminist alliances more widely, where individual entities seek to negotiate common goals. Both the case studies reveal that Pacific feminists have disagreements and diverse priorities, but they stand a better chance of sustaining their collective activity when they rely on an intersectional notion of solidarity. This can assist others similarly wanting to deliberate to form an alliance around joint problems and to effect progress to gender equality without insisting on a consensus or letting differences be a barrier to progress. They reveal novel ways of tackling alliance building across difference with solidarity emerging. This can influence creation of more negotiated spaces, fostering feminist ideas and combining resources. Giving resources and time to hear the voices of the full diversity of Pacific feminisms will help to continue to organise and amplify their engagement. As this is a working paper, I welcome any comments as well as suggestions or helpful tips on publishing it or where I might publish it or an introduction to others working on something similar. And my full paper certainly puts this empirical case in the context of building on scholarship in social movements, intersectionality, alliance building, civil society, Pacific regional studies, and applied research for development. So I thank you for your attention and I'm really open to any questions or comments.